Happy March, everyone! It's the third month of the season, and you know what that means. A big patch is here to shake up the field, bringing us a suite of changes to Chikyu Chaos Reigns to help tune up some underperformers. But we're also getting a much larger standard patch than usual for this time of the season, in anticipation of the Revolution World Championships this April, giving players more time to get accustomed to the new meta rather than being ambushed with some of these changes 1 month from now. As always, there are links in the description below for your key resources to check out all things Revolution Custom Standard, such as the Custom Magic Discord server where you can get updates about and play the format against others, as well as check out all of the cool cards and sets being developed by other people in the community. The Revolution Compendium, where you can look through all of the cards that the curators recommend for consideration in your decks, sorted by card roles. The official LackeyBot format search, a Scryfall-like search engine integrated to the same website as the compendium and tournament data, complete with patch history and data on what decks a card is seeing play in. And finally, Escape from Limbo, a website using the GitHub framework set up by Canterbury Egg and showcasing the cards in the format with complete visual spoilers, a random card button, and a sets catalog, and a built-in deck builder. Check out all of these spaces with links in the description below, and also check out the GP Kinda City Finals, also linked in the description below, commentated on by Dr. Chipmunk. With all of that said, we have a ton of cards changing in this patch across 14 in-rotation changes, mostly addressing cards from last month's GP, as well as our usual mid-season buff patch, this time bringing a couple reworks to some Chikyu legendary creatures and an overhaul to the Berry Token suite. We've also got one Eternal card catching a rework in the wake of our first ever Eternal exhibition, to address yet another combo it has created after the last one got addressed at the start of the year. Without further ado, let's dive in. The biggest way in which last month was shaped by the patch notes in the wake of January was that for all its prominence in the first GP of the season, Battle Control got away with a very light tap overall. That light tap may have played a part in the two players that brought it last month both soaring to spectacular finishes, with both Dr. Chipmunk and Caillou102 being the only two undefeated players out of the Swiss rounds, with Chip finishing at a respectable semifinals end and Caillou taking the crown. Now, it's time for Battles to take some real hits that it dodged last month. Starting with Clash at Orith Cross, its starting defense is going up by 1, and the ability at taking 2 damage is shifted from a gradual end-step token engine to 2 immediate 2/2s with Vigilance. Less importantly, at least in terms of the new updated design, Clash's Anthem upon defeat has been replaced with an on-attack trigger to gain you life equals the number of creatures you're attacking with. I think this remains a pretty powerful board wipe, and if anything, it might be even better, because there's far more immediacy in that first trigger, and it contributes a more significant amount of stats to the board up front. It's not too far-fetched to develop Clash alongside holding up a shock or following up with a damaging loyalty ability from a Planeswalker, meaning you can bounce back more cleanly, and with the defeated condition being so situational now, there's seldom much reason to push extra damage towards it. I think this just continues to make waves and is honestly probably an even better board wipe because you don't really need to defeat it to get the full value out of your tokens. They get the +1/+1 in Vigilance compared to where they used to be anyways. Path of Scales is catching 2 more hits to its overall potency, in addition to the one it received last month. Its Enter trigger is moving from a draw 3 to a more open card selection effect, letting you dig 5 cards deep, but only getting 2 cards to your hand instead of 3. It's also going up by 1 starting defense, meaning you can't just set up the stat debuff with a shock like you could with Orith Cross's token generation now. This is a slight boon for Wormshot, which was kind of pushed out by some of the other ways to directly deal damage to battles, as now this is the only thing that can cleanly defeat Path of Scales on its own as a burn spell. But I think it's more likely you'll just run 2 bolt effects to try and defeat this if you still run Path of Scales at all, since the damage thresholds cleanly mark off at instances of 3 damage, and the Enter trigger is not awful considering Stock Up sees significant cannon play, and this is just 1 more mana for added value later on. Clash at Mistrit Vale, meanwhile, gets my favorite of the battle reworks. Its defense has actually been lowered by 1, and rather than spitting out a 1/1 soldier each time you cast a non-creature spell, it just checks at the end step to see if you have done so to make a single token. More importantly, that 2 damage threshold has gone from rebuying an instant or sorcery to instead giving your creatures prowess. So while it's less of a value engine over time, it's much better at pushing the game to a close the faster you're able to just sort of spiral out of control on the board. The 4 defense marker also just generally is easier to push through, so I could see this getting more meaningful play rather than being the third battle you reach for if you're trying to do something like battle control. Now, these are all really strong end result effects for these battles, so you might be wondering, what are the actual nerfs here? Well, it's not just the battles that are actually changing for battle control. We're also getting hits to the usual suspects responsible for defeating them. Electronic countermeasures is losing its ability to target battles altogether, meaning you won't be able to instantly defeat anything with this. One of the more difficult to disrupt components of battle control was the fact that its burn spells were not only good against aggressive and mid-rangey strategies, but could also get you value through defeating your battles. And with countermeasures being able to target a battle that was already defeated, especially something like Path of Scales or Clash at Orithcross, where it was also corrupting countermeasures, that threatened to make it so countermeasures could just dig you 5 cards deep and get you one of those cards in a pinch when you need something else to be doing. So losing out on this option to both defeat and dig with your battles is pretty significant. Path of Exoneration, the adventure on Ukius Crusaris, is also taking a hit, though a less substantial one. It's jumping up to 3 mana and being allowed to turn to hitting your opponent directly now. Turns out, a Lightning Helix that draws you a late-game win condition is pretty powerful and worth shedding targeting the face. And the life gain on top of Path of Scales reducing opposing power made it profoundly difficult for aggressive decks to adequately punch through battle control in a lot of circumstances. This uptick in cost makes Crusaris less of a free include, but still better than something like Vow to Conquer, for instance, as I suspect being able to effectively draw an 8-drop later on and not get your burn peeled out of hand by a duress is still pretty significant. It's not as quick and efficient, and I'm happy to see that here, but don't count Ukius Crusaris out fully. Lastly, for clear battle control changes, though this saw plenty of use outside of battles, Elton on the Silent Star was proving to be too effective at locking out strategies that were looking to commit to the board. Eltonon showed up in a third of all GP decks last month, across 5 decks running him in the main and 2 in the sideboard, with one of those decks not even running white mana sources in the mana base, leaning solely on Iviana to make the necessary treasures. And the battle control element makes itself more apparent because both of the Eltonon decks that made the top cut were the 2 battle control decks in the field. As a result, Path of Stillness's flexibility was just kind of proving to be too tricky, so it's been made more consistent to play around by way of its X being locked at 2. So it's now a 4-mana sorcery that removes all 2-mana value or less non-land permanents from play. This still prohibits it from being used alongside things like Sanctum of Repression, and still gives it some clear strengths in the face of things like token strategies, but it now has much cleaner counterplay from aggressive strategies by way of just pushing their curves up towards things like Syra Blade of Memory, Fabricated Anomaly, Redeemer of Hollowed Flesh, and more. Of all the battle control changes, I think the interactive suite will be felt much more so than the battles themselves, and I do think the battles could still see some real play, but countermeasures, Crusaris, and Eltonon become a lot more situational. One last minor inclusion here for battle control, though this isn't a tangible change, Overrule Thought is being renamed to Overrule Will. I will absolutely still probably get this mixed up with the other card I was confusing it with, but what can you do? Now, for more scattershot standard changes, we'll start with Skyray Tender, which is taking a slight hit in the form of a stat drop to the absolute minimum of 0-1 on the base body itself. While reactions I've seen point to this just being a full nerf, which I couldn't see the argument for, I can't help but call for an audible on the conversation here. Tender now picks up a +1/+1 counter freely off of its first attack when you curve into a Fabricated Anomaly off of it, and ultimately, the thing of highest importance with Tender is the 2/1 flying token, which remains unscathed. In terms of overall pressure, this certainly is a nerf, but I think folks are counting this one out a little too quickly. Still absolutely give Skyray Tender some credit here. Halo Tracers catching a hike in mana cost from 2 to 3, and getting a +1 power boost to compensate. This is a big headache for the green-white life gain deck innovated on by Laurel, as the 2-drop slot was already looking a bit open, and the 3-drop slot was getting pretty crowded between Commander of the Vow, Eloris the Pathfinder, and Syra Blade of Memory. That being said, this does open the door for a clean 4th 3-drop to find off of foes unfed when X is 3. So perhaps that's a way for the deck to adapt to this struggle, especially since there are still other reasonable creatures for the deck to find off of unfed in a pinch. Aldegar of Path Unwoven is up next, getting a minor buff to his stats once made into a dragon with his 0 ability, from 5/5 to 6/6. He's really struggled to see reliable play, and this could maybe be a meaningful buff, but I'm not holding my breath on this being what swings the needle on him. His use alongside Thorn and Trial is something I found myself exploring, though, so there could still be room for Aldegar to prove his worth. And I think one of the biggest things against Aldegar, being the strength of Graveyard Hate right now, is also taking a slight hit, as we'll get to soon. So maybe Aldegar will get a chance to show up after all. Cleansing Starfire is catching a hike in mana cost and damage from 3s to 4s, in part to make up for the changes to Uki's Crusaris, resulting in it stepping on this one's toes a bit. While this seems pretty openly like a nerf, I do think this actually opens up an avenue for use alongside the change to Clash at Mistrit Vale, with Clash curving into Starfire and being immediately defeated by it, and future copies of Starfire benefiting well from Clash's cost reduction clause. Starfire's life gain trigger also just works well with battles, since the starting defense can further pad your life total as your trigger for the turn, if I understand correctly. I'm not sure it'll be a meta-defining interaction, but it's worth keeping an eye on and experimenting with if it catches your interest. Crucible of the Burning Sun had absolutely dominated the graveyard tech field since its introduction back in Exalt of Twiltree, courtesy of both its strong exile effect and the repeat value it offered up, making it so potent that players have begun considering it worthy of a main deck slot in some cases, since it helps smooth out draws for slower strategies. Crucible's ubiquity has now been shaken, however, as it is losing that second trigger altogether, only retaining its static ability. This opens the door for Faces of the Faceless and Archival Storage to start emerging back into the meta, and makes more room for graveyard strategies to start returning to the fold after Crucible's prominence helped shove Aristocrats decks out of the meta, despite everyone bracing for it. There are still some really strong color-specific graveyard hate options between our rare white defender or I believe it's the rare black battle. So there's definitely still real options to reach for outside of just the colorless suite, but the colorless suite is getting a bit more competitive rather than just being dominated by Crucible. Last up for our standard facing changes, outside of the buff patch of course, we've got a pair of eternal facing adjustments, starting with Creation Mythos catching a nerf to its immediate mana cheat power. Mythos was seeing use in both formats, in standard searching up Revolutionary's Monument in a Naya Enchantments shell, where it would let you flip cheap value permanents into more significant bombs and more immediate value off of your nearly free 7/7, while in Eternal, it could find your singleton copy of Vorpal Titan, and that proved to be pretty backbreaking even if it was not unbeatable. Now, Mythos can no longer search your graveyard, meaning you'll need to actually run multiple copies of your target if you want to keep finding it again and again, and it discounts enchantment spells in addition to artifacts. While that discount extending to enchantments looks like a buff initially, and it can be in some scenarios, it also importantly means that casting Creation Mythos disables the cheat the turn you cast it, because that'll be your first enchantment spell of the turn. You can still get away with some nonsense by slipping it into play off of the Weft Heart, which it was already kind of getting to do in Standard, so there might still be some staying power here, but it is being reined in significantly. Also aimed a bit at Eternal, Divine Repurposing actually took down the inaugural Eternal exhibition in the hands of its designer, Scribble, who both put the theory to work by using it as a tool in a green-red ramp tokens list by using Alwanor as the target of choice for its in-hand flexibility to also create a token that ramps into a turn 3 repurposing. Stellar synergy right there, by the way. But also, with Scribble catching an unintended bug of the card. See, the end of turn clause, or rather, end the turn clause, was meant to limit its ability to scam enter triggers or hasty threats into play. But one wrinkle in that clause is that ending the turn exiles all spells from the stack, including repurposing, meaning the flashback cost here actually just becomes invalidated if you can actually resolve repurposing. Rather than taking away the flashback, this has now shed that end the turn clause, instead just stripping the target of all abilities for the turn. While Scribble's Eternal list leveraged some of the best non-creature token-generating spells the colors have access to in the format, the core of repurposing an Alwanor is very new to Standard, so it could absolutely still make waves in rotation if people want to start experimenting with it. And certainly, this change opens the door for other funky things that it couldn't do previously, like getting a Lorana Loop's End into play untapped with no stun counters on them. Very fun change here. I'm excited to mess around with it. For Chikyu's buff patch, there are two standalone adjustments we should start with. Tanky Storm Chaser now lives up to her name, shedding her activated ability to instead give your weather spells Storm, provided you've spent all 5 colors of mana in the turn, even if you spend some of that mana to cast the weather spell itself. This is a trickier condition to meet than either of her previous incarnations, certainly, but it's far splashier and makes a more meaningful demand of your mana base. There are some strong 3-mana weathers available, such as Sandstorm and Sunny Day, that you could chain into and Tanky can find from your sideboard, meaning if you can cast Tanky into one of those with your first 5 mana of a turn, potentially with all 5 colors of mana to start your turn, that right there gets you a second copy of the weather, and if you can do other spells prior to casting Tanky, or prior to casting the weather in turn, you can get more copies of those weathers overall, and both Sandstorm and Sunny Day are massive damage spikes on your board, especially when gotten in multiple copies. I think these are real avenues of play that you can open up with Tanky, giving your Weather Storm while pulling one of your choice out of your sideboard, meaning you get to choose what thing you're giving Storm to, pretty much, is absolutely colossal in terms of potential build-around power. It just makes some really high demands on how much you can actually meaningfully do to meet the requirements asked of you. We'll see if any decks emerge that can actually meet those demands, and if not, this will be just a fun sort of gimmicky meme thing to mess around with, and I'll be excited to see if anyone tries to make this work in Brawl next time we have a Brawl GP. A more cleanly relevant legendary change for rotation comes for End of Mutations, which is picking up 2 points of toughness to a clean 5/5 stat line and having its Lava Axe trigger moved from punishing instant speed play to punish non-creature spells out of decks that don't commit to the board instead. I'll call it as I see it. This is a huge upgrade for End of Mutations to justify its role in places like Big Boros and other strong mid-range or ramp strategies. And the only real point of awkwardness for End of Mutations that I can see is that one of the decks where it could most cleanly slot into, that being Red-Green Ramp, already has a strong pair of Chikyu 6-drops to find in Warden of Tremors and Hoenn Champion. This could be another place for Foes Unfed to make itself known, though, as pumping 8 mana into Foes to offer up 3 creatures alongside these 3 creatures alongside something like Aurora Buffer Exec could be a back-breaking line to have to play against. The fact that this also now just gets to dodge Deafening Clarion and Nightfall, 2 of the most prominently played board wipes, is pretty significant. So big ups for End of Mutations. This is a much more scary threat now than it used to be. Beyond those 2 cards, we have one major elephant in the room to address. Berry tokens have been reworked and redesigned. Slightly. They're now just granting an additional stat boost from +1/+1 up to +2/+2. This change allows berries to be more impactful for in-combat uses, as well as improve their functions through pushing damage and protecting against burn spells. But they come at the cost of hindering some of the tools available that spit out berry tokens to adjust for the heightened stats here. In some cases, this results in stat reductions to the baseline effect. Hungry Songbird is losing a point of toughness, though I'm not sure that matters, and I'm not sure the buff improves its playability. Or more relevantly, this brings a toughness hit to Pathetic Cocoon, as well as Smiling Sludge. Cocoon and Sludge are certainly more impactful hits here, but I think they are ultimately welcome ones, as both cards still have definite strength to justify their inclusion, and this makes it so decks leaning on them don't get to block cheap aggro threats as comfortably. Cocoon and Sludge will probably still see play, at least as far as my prediction goes, but they won't be as impactful on the board. We've also got hits to overall output of berries. Bloombrute goes from making 2 berries to 1, ultimately just consolidating the stat generation here, and the same change is coming to Canopy Creeper's Enter Trigger. There's also another berry creation hit, with Aroma Spinner no longer freely equipping the berries it makes, though this does shine a spotlight on the strength of Rooting Raccoon dodging this change. And I think the stat increase for the berries makes Raccoon a much more tangible mid-range tool to consider moving forward. Beyond those changes, we also get a couple ways for berry cards to just get cleaned up. Practicing Guru's static ability now just folds in the indestructible granting rather than needing to sacrifice a berry that's on it to get that effect, functionally making it so it gets an additional +1/+1 when it eats a berry, regardless of whether or not you have to do so to give it indestructible. The Berry Master's pump effect on the activation now grants +3/+3 instead of +2/+2 to mark the improvement from the baseline berry effect. Feasting Predator has regained its free berry sacrifice ability now that berries are less trivial to spit out overall, and rather than it shrinking stats and carrying Death Touch innately, instead gets to buff itself and pick up Trample, becoming a much more interesting way to finish off the board when you're just kind of treating berries as trinket tokens. And Poisoned Rose now gets to innately have Death Touch, making it a more relevant creature at its baseline. Lastly, Goldberry is getting a small tweak to bring it in line with the Berry Master, having its own innate berry trigger go up to +3/+3 as compensation for the mana it asks you to spend on it. Our final change of the patch is our third Eternal Leaning change, and the only card exclusive to Eternal, with Marked Passage once again getting slapped on the wrist for creating a crazy 2-card combo with a blue 3-drop, this time courtesy of Lunar Vigil. Vigil's replacement effect, allowing you to circumvent a forced draw at your draw step, means that you could Marked Passage the turn after you play a Vigil and pay 0 life into Passage to draw a card, replacing that draw with Vigil as well, and then repeating as much as you please to pile as many night counters onto the enchantment as you want. And then you can freely either sacrifice Vigil to draw a bunch of cards and make a bunch of mana, or just target the opponent to deck them out on the spot. For its repeat combo crimes, Marked Passage is getting a bigger rework than it did back in January, moving to a triple black sorcery that lets you pay life equal to the mana you've spent on spells in the turn to draw that many cards, serving as a baseline 3 mana draw 3 lose 3, and being able to scale up as you get more mana to spend on spells. This likely removes it from the conversation in Eternal, but considering its recent history as a combo nonsense tool, I think I'm cool with that. Props to Tremor, though, for catching this combo in the last Eternal exhibition. And that wraps up our patch review for March of 2026. Before I head out, if you were looking for my GP final thoughts or my commentary on the GP Kinda City finals, unfortunately neither of those are coming. Last month started to hit me with a lot of burnout between field test and things going on in my life outside of custom Magic. But if you do want to check out the finals match, I highly recommend you tune into Dr. Chipmunk's commentary on the end card or in the description below. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing how this new meta develops and informs where the World Championships field will land in a month's time. So hopefully we're in for another fun, diverse GP in the coming weeks. As always, links in the description below if you want to check out the format for yourself. And until the next GP, I'll see you all in the Revolution chat. Bye-bye!